For those who weren't here last week, my reaction to the prospective new incumbent of this wonderful church was, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. And some people wondered where that phrase came from. Well, it comes from the Civil War in America, where, of course, the Southern troops, the Confederates, fought against the Northern Union troops. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, second letter, there is this phrase, examine yourselves to see whether you are living in the faith. Most of us would only have a passing acquaintance with ourselves. We're familiar with the image that looked back at us in the morning as we face the bathroom mirror. We're aware of the daily rituals that punctuate our lives. We know about our taste in foods, music, and friends. But perhaps we know little about the self that lies hidden beneath superficial appearances. During my years at the University of Queensland, one of the subjects that I studied in my Bachelor of Divinity was called The History of Christian Thought. And the lecturer was an Anglican priest, and his name was Canon Iver Church. Now, I'm not making this up. It cracked us up to have someone called Iver Church, and he was an Anglican priest. How's that? And on one occasion, he wrote a question on the board. Which of the required readings in this course did you find the least interesting? Then, after about 10 minutes, allowing the class to write down their responses, he wrote another question on the board. To what defect in yourself do you attribute this lack of interest? A benign question suddenly turned into a deeper soul-searching one because it required us as students to look within ourselves for the answer. When I was chaplain at St Leonard's College a number of years ago, a father came to see me about his daughter. Like a number of 14-year-old daughters, she was giving her parents a bit of a run for their money. The father wanted me to talk to his daughter so she wouldn't continue to give them angst and trouble. It didn't take long to come to the conclusion that the real problem lay with the father and not with the daughter. Certainly, she was acting out some really bad behaviour, yet it was in response to a controlling, dominating, and insensitive father who believed that every statement he uttered in the family should be obeyed. The father lacked the insight into his own behaviour. He wanted things fixed, but on his terms. And everyone in the family had to change, of course, except him. He wasn't prepared to look inside himself and see what his contribution was to how this family was functioning or not functioning. Sometimes, of course, it is difficult to examine or test ourselves, isn't it? Yet often the answers to the important questions in life are really found within ourselves. Socrates, of course, many of you would remember, who lived between 469 and 399 BCE, once said that the life which is unexamined is not worth living. What did he really mean by that? Did he mean that we had to sit in some narcissistic navel-gazing experiment and contemplate our own needs and wants to the exclusion of all others? I think that what he was trying to get at was life which is fulfilling and satisfying for a person is a life which is constantly aware of its emotions, motivations, and ultimately responsible for its actions. There's a branch of psychology, of course, today called Mindfulness, which is what that is exactly about. So to examine your life is to put your life under the scrutiny of your values and beliefs and to live your life in an intentional way, not haphazardly, where we are vulnerable to the latest fads or influences upon us. It was almost 200 years prior to Socrates, the Greek philosopher Thalys, who lived between 620 and 546 BCE, had written these words: "The most difficult thing in life is to know thyself." A.C. Grayling, in his most recent book, The History of Philosophy, says that Thales was the first philosopher because he did not rely on legends, myths, ancient scriptures, teachings or traditions. He relied on observation and reason. However, none of his writings survive today, but he is so esteemed by succeeding thinkers such as Aristotle, Heraclitus, Democritus, Pythagoras and Euclid, to name a few, that in matters of investigation they were advised to consult Thales' thoughts first. The most difficult thing in life is to know thyself. Of course, many of us may be afraid to know ourselves because of what we might discover. We are suspicious of unwanted or unruly elements that sometimes surface in our lives in unguarded moments. And when it has taken many years to construct a positive self-image, we don't want any contradictions. All of us, of course, in our living develop a mask, a kind of facade that Carl Jung called the persona. This facade plays an important part in our life. It helps us to adapt to our environment. It is the outer garment that we cloak ourselves with as we present ourselves to the wider world and audience. It aids us in our development of a style of life and facilitates us in our project of living. The underside of the persona, of course, is the shadow, which I mentioned last week. The more we become identified with the persona, the stronger will be the shadow. They are compensatory. The brighter the outer light, the engaging social side, the darker will be the hidden shadow. Carl Jung, of course, is famous for formulating the concept of the shadow, the portion of our personalities which through the course of our life is relegated to the darkness of the unconscious mind. Connie Zui, in her book Meeting the Shadow, says this about the nature of the shadow, and I quote, "The shadow goes by many familiar names: the disowned self, the lower self, the dark twin or brother in biblical and myth, the double, the repressed self, the alter ego, and the id. And when we come face to face with our darker side, we use metaphors to describe these shadow encounters, and we talk about meeting our demons, wrestling with the devil, descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, or a midlife crisis. Although the shadow is an innate part of what being a human is all about, the vast majority of us are willingly blind regarding its existence. We hide our negative qualities, not only from others, but from ourselves. And to do this, we often criticise and condemn others to ensure that our focus does not fall on our own faults and destructive tendencies. Jung, of course, called this projection. So when we encounter our shadow, we project the worst part of ourselves onto another so that we come up smelling like roses. We go through life then with a false air of moral superiority and a belief that while others act immorally and destructively, we ourselves are wholly virtuous and always in the right. So in order to avoid being the victim of shadow possession, we must become conscious of our shadow qualities and integrate them into our conscious personalities. accepting them with open arms, not as abhorrent aspects of ourself, but as necessary and vital parts of our being. So toward this end, it is useful to realise that the task in life is not to become perfect, but to become whole. Much of our personality then lies in the shadows. If this were not the case, then our lives would be like a film set, all frontage with nothing behind, easily destroyed and disposed of. The shadow is unconscious, for it lies below the surface. And in the course of our growth and development as people, all of us find that there are certain impulses, feelings, tendencies that are unacceptable. We have, of course, devised ways over the years of getting rid of them. We banish them from our lives. However, we soon discover that what we had banished has never really left us. It was merely hidden and continued its own life from the depths of our being. Since we did not own these unacceptable impulses, they tend to own us, and they need to be reclaimed in our lives if our growth as people is to occur. Whether or not we decide to become better acquainted then with ourselves is a personal decision. We may choose to carry on as we always have, to take life as it comes and not worry too much about it, what we don't know about ourselves. However, if that is your choice, a certain consequence flows. We may fail to realise the extent to which we have been moulded by others and influenced by them, particularly by the way we have been defined by the attitudes and actions of significant others in our lives. And if you want to explore yourself and knowing yourself, let me in conclusion offer a number of guidelines for you. I discussed this with a friend of mine, Reverend Graham Chapman, who used to be a lecturer in theology and Christian thought at one of the theological colleges here in Melbourne. And we came up with this list, that we need to maintain an attitude of openness to reality. For it's this sort of openness is what Christian theology talks about as faith. Be intentional about your quest. Don't become compulsive, but take things gently in your life. Be attentive or aware. Pay attention to your senses and to your body. Learn to listen to your intuition. Don't be afraid of spending time on your own. Seek occasional solitude. For as the mystic in the Middle Ages, Meister Eckhart, suggested, it is important that we explore our own treasure. And you will discover that the deepest lessons come through suffering, for it was through suffering that Job encountered the self and the spirit in his life. It is important to ritualise insights and transitions, for most of us do our processing solely with our minds, but there is a place for emotional processing in our rituals, as insights are integrated through bodily movement, which is what we'll do in a few moments' time. Central among the number of imposing ruins that are interspersed on the southern slopes of the Parthenos mountain in Greece is the Temple of Apollo. It dates back to the 4th century BCE. It was first built around the 7th century BCE. This temple was destroyed by an earthquake in 373 BCE. An inscription that is etched into one of the walls and which still can be seen today is this phrase, "Know thyself." The physical temple has all but disappeared, but the concept of knowing oneself lives on.